would lead to economic revenue of around 1.6 to 6.6 billion. In EU, for example, it's estimated that that number will actually be around about 27 billion. That's through the creation of value-added services and through enterprise. It is also argued that the new combinations of data can create new knowledge and insights and to lead to whole new fields of application. So the classic example given in presentations such as these is Dr. Snow's cholera map, in which he identified the relationship between contaminated drinking water and cholera by combining data sets on cholera outbreaks with the location of water wells, and actually led to a whole new field of application known today as the modern field of epidemiology. So we all know in the 19th century there were several outbreaks of cholera in London, and compared basically two of those, 1849 and 1854. The 1849 outbreak, for example, two companies were actually supplying water to this area, and then basically in 1854, one of those had actually relocated, which was the Lambeth Water Company. And actually by comparing, or actually plotting the distribution of deaths on a map, realised that there was actually a cluster around one water well. By removing the handle to the pump, the number of deaths declined rapidly. And so an example of investigative fieldwork providing very useful insight in actually what you can actually obtain by combining data sets. And if we actually fast forward 150 years, we actually have a child of the open data movement, known as the Ohio map, which was used to actually investigate the correlation between race and access to public water services in the Coal Run area in Muscatine County, Ohio. And the majority of this data is actually based on information that was actually obtained from the public repositories. But by combining these different data sets, it identified differential access to water services. That is, that non-white residents were less likely to actually have access to water services compared to their white counterparts. And it actually led to a court trial in which the non-white residents were actually awarded $11 million by the federal court. So actually an example there of how open data was actually used towards actually justice. So open data here, I define, refers to the philosophical and methodological approach to the democratization of data, enabling citizens to access and create value through the use of public sector information. It is a philosophy and practice requiring that certain data sets be made available without patents and copyrights, subject only at most to attribute and share alike. And so when one speaks about open government data, we're speaking about statistics, we're speaking about geospatial data, to court decisions, to locations of hospitals, etc. And today, the open data movement is actually gaining momentum and linked to other open source movements such as open access. And while it's initially started, one can actually argue, in the UK and in the US with pioneering initiatives such as data.gov.uk and data.gov, we're actually seeing this actually being replicated in a number of cities, states and countries across the globe. So for example, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, 16 of the 27 EU countries all now have open data initiatives providing information or non-sensitive information to the public, non-government organisations and businesses. And in the UK, we have the data catalogue, data.gov.uk, which is a web portal which provides access to, so it claims, 6,000 government data sets. It actually provides you a link to those data sets. And officially launched in September 2009, January in beta, and then actually launched in January 2010. It actually provides a range of information, for example, infection rates within hospitals, information on energy consumptions within certain government departments, alongside the combined online information systems, which provides expenditure data for the actual government itself. And today we see an army of community of data users and developers which are actually taking this data, actually holding power to account, using the data to actually re-engineer public services, as well as an opportunity there to actually create new businesses, create new enterprises. And today the number of applications has actually increased from 49 derived applications, which is actually listed on the website, to 140. So examples include Fix My Street, but also Schooloscope, which is a nice example, which allows one to actually compare statistics for different schools. But as I argue, and the reason for the workshop is that open data really only represents the first step. Data actually has no value if it's not actually being used. And so the very idea that simply if you actually have an online catalogue, people will simply come and use it, doesn't really actually exist, and there's no guarantee of openness and transparency in the mere fact that you actually make that data available. And at this point, I'm arguing that, okay, information should be legally available, should be technically available, but also it must also be socially available. That is, you must actually empower people to actually use the information itself. And I, in partnership with Ordnance Survey, Dave Martin at the University of Southampton and others, including Talus, have actually been conducting a series of open data masterclasses. So we've been actually travelling from the University of Southampton to Aberdeen, from the Royal Geographical Society in London to the University of Swansea, in which we've engaged with over 800 people so far, from the third sector to the academics, the researchers to the business sector, about the potential benefits as well as some of the challenges involved in actually harnessing and utilising open data. And the reason we have done this is that we realise that we now need to move away from simply just releasing data sets to actually understanding who's in a position to make effective use of this data. And that can only be addressed if you actually provide education and training. And one such example is through the actual masterclasses themselves. And in this workshop, we're actually taking this conversation to another level, in that we're actually trying to address some of the fundamental questions. So how do you actually mark up and release open data? What is the importance of geospatial data? How do you actually sustain open data initiatives? So the idea of sustaining is that while open data is free, it is actually comes at a cost. So for example, if you take the World Bank open data set, to release their data sets, they actually had to lose revenues of around $2 to $3 million. That didn't account for the amount of money that was actually spent developing the catalogues, the tools, translating into all the various languages. There is also this issue that actually having a catalogue like data.gov.uk and data.gov actually costs money to actually sustain over the long term. So a recent example of data.gov was that it was actually due to close in the US earlier this year because of budgetary cuts from 32 billion to 6 billion. Now, for example, if you take one example of that catalogue, which is the US spending.gov, it actually costs $4 million per year just to actually run, and it only actually has 10,000 hits per month. That's equivalent to $330,000 per month to actually run the catalogue. And so through these presentations by our various speakers today, we'll actually address some of the fundamental questions actually within this space. And so my argument, therefore, is that open data is one of the building blocks towards transparency and accountability, but it is one of the blocks in many. And while it represents many opportunities, as you'll hear today, it also represents many challenges. Again, a number of speakers will address this. And so we should always think from the perspective that opening up your data represents only, as I said, the first step. There's many more to actually go. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker, Peter Mooney from the University of Maynooth.